Chapter 11. Stranger in a Strange Land. Harriet Tubman's moment of exultation passed quickly. According to her own words, there was no one to welcome me to the land of freedom. I was a stranger in a strange land, and my home, after all, was down in the old cabin quarter with the old folks and my brothers and sisters. When she thought of her family left behind in Maryland, all of them slaves, her joy in having escaped rapidly left her. She decided that as soon as she could, she would go back to Dorchester County and lead her family north too. She knew the way now. She knew what a fugitive would do on the nights when it rained and the North Star was obscured. She had groped her way along, fingering the bark of trees, finding out which side the moss grew the thickest, moving slowly from tree to tree. Her hands had been cold, and the moss was spongy and wet, and the bark of the trees was rough. But she had done it once alone, and with the help of the Lord she would do it again and again until she got all of her family out of Maryland. That year, 1849, she went to work in a hotel in Philadelphia as a cook. She had always hated housework. She felt trapped inside the kitchen where she worked, yet she stayed there a year, cooking, washing dishes and pots and pans, scrubbing the floor. She saved most of the money she earned, hoarding the tips she was given. She would need money when she went back into slave territory. At first she found Philadelphia a strange and frightening place. The streets were filled with people. There was the constant movement of horses and wagons and fine carriages. The buildings were taller than any she had ever seen. She was constantly surprised by the number of colored people that she saw, by their speech, and the fine clothes that they wore. She soon learned that many of these people were fugitive slaves, like herself. She knew moments of homesickness, when she longed for the quarter, remembering the old familiar smoky smell of the cabin, the good smell of the earth when it was plowed in the spring. Early in 1850 she visited the office of the Philadelphia Vigilance Committee. Sooner or later all fugitive slaves in the city went there seeking information about their relatives, or with requests for help of one kind or another. It was in this office, upstairs in Lebanon Seminary, that she learned the extent of the network of stops on the Underground Railroad. By 1850 the road was doing a tremendous volume of business. Philadelphia was its principal center in the East. William Still, a Negro, was the secretary of the Vigilance Committee. J. Miller McKim, a Quaker, was the president. The committee and its members were prepared to offer assistance to fugitives at any hour of the day or night. It might be in the form of food, clothing, money, railroad tickets, or a place to hide. Again and again Harriet went back to the office of the Vigilance Committee. As she listened to the stories that Still told, she came to the conclusion that almost any slave who had the courage to run away was certain to reach his destination, the North. But the slaves did not know this. She decided that she would spread the word through Maryland. She herself, by accident or intuition, or the grace of God, had come all the way from Dorchester County on the Underground Railroad, and on her own 2 feet. As soon as she had saved money enough to take care of any emergencies that might arise, she would go back there for her family, and anyone else who wanted to be free. In December 1850 she arranged for the escape of her sister, her sister's husband, John Bowley, and their 2 children, one of them a baby. Though John Bowley was free, his wife and children were slaves. He had learned that his family was to be sold. When he received this information, he went to a Quaker friend of his for advice and help. The man was an agent of the Underground Railroad who lived in Cambridge, Maryland. The Quaker agent in Cambridge, knowing, as all such people did, that he was watched constantly, and that his mail might be censored, sent a message to William Still in Philadelphia. The message, which was passed along the underground route from one person to another, said that there were 2 large bales of wool and 2 small ones that would have to be transported from Baltimore to Philadelphia. The Cambridge agent said that a small boat would be available for the shipment from Cambridge to Baltimore, but he was worried about the trip from there to Philadelphia. He would, however, rely on the ingenuity of the Vigilance Committee to take care of the matter after the merchandise reached Baltimore. He pointed out that speed was absolutely essential in this undertaking. In Philadelphia, almost every evening after work, Harriet climbed the long flight of stairs which led to a loft in the building which housed Lebanon Seminary. This served as the office for the Philadelphia Vigilance Committee. She was fascinated by the stories she heard told in that big bare room. Quite often a party of fugitive slaves arrived while she was there, and she watched William Still write their names in the big notebook that he kept, not only their names, but something of their history, too. On several occasions she had seen runaways who came from the Eastern Shore. Thus she was able to get a little third-hand information about her father and mother, Ben and old Rit, or about one of her brothers or sisters. Whenever she saw any of these newly escaped slaves, she never failed to think how miraculous it was that a group of people, sometimes only one, sometimes two or three or four, should have had the courage to start for an unknown destination without food or money or friends, with only the burning desire for freedom to keep them going. Anyone who saw them would know they were fugitives. Their clothes were torn and snagged by briars, burrs were clinging to them. They were either barefoot, or their shoes were literally worn out from walking, the soles flapping, the uppers held on by string. They were startled by any unexpected sound. If there were footsteps on the long flight of stairs, or a door closed suddenly, they jumped up, trembling, nostrils distended, eyes wide open. One night, a quiet night there in the loft, William Still was talking to J. Miller McKim and to Harriet when a stranger entered the office. He nodded to Harriet and then went over to the desk where he carried on a low-voiced conversation with Still and McKim. Suddenly Still beckoned to Harriet. "Maybe you can help us find a woman to—" Then he interrupted himself. "There's a man named—" Even though no outsider could have overheard him, he lowered his voice. "Named John Bowley." "Bowley?" Harriet said. "John Bowley? Where's he from?" "From Cambridge, Maryland, and—" "Why, that's my brother-in-law," she said, excitement in her voice. "He's married to my sister Mary, and why, he's a free man. What's the trouble?" "Yes, he's free," said Still, "but his wife and children are slaves, and they are about to be sold. We know how to get them to Baltimore, but we've got to find someone to guide them from Baltimore to Philadelphia, preferably a woman, because there's a baby and another child. We thought you might know of a woman who would—" "I will," she said promptly. But Mr. Still shook his head. He said it was difficult for free Negroes with all their papers in order to leave Baltimore. For her to attempt to bring them out when she was a fugitive herself would be an impossibility. They would be weighed, measured at the railroad station or at the dock, and this information would be compared with the description of all other known runaways. Even if this family bore no resemblance to any other fugitives, they still could not leave until they had obtained a bond signed by two well-known residents. "Mr. Still," Harriet laughed, "you're trying to scare me, and I don't scare easy. Besides, I know enough about the Underground Railroad now so that I know you don't have to go through any weighing and measuring to get a group of people out of Baltimore. That's my sister and her husband and her children, and I'm the one that's going to Baltimore to get them." William Still threw up his hands. "All right," he said, "but please, please be careful." On the morning that a message arrived saying that all the necessary careful arrangements had been completed, John Bowley's wife and two children had been already picked up with a group of slaves and placed in a slave pen at the courthouse in Cambridge. The auction had started that morning with the sale of prime field hands. No one showed any interest in purchasing the women and children in the lot. At noon the auctioneer called a recess. He said that he would put the females on the block later on in the day, and went off to the inn to get his dinner. He paused a moment in the doorway and grumbled to the guard. "Much good it will do to put 'em up. Not much interest in 'em." Meanwhile John Bowley and his Quaker friend had evolved a plan, a bold and desperate plan, which might or might not work. Shortly after the auctioneer went to the inn, John entered the courthouse carrying a large, white, official-looking envelope. He handed it to the guard who stood near the slave pen and said, "It's a message from my master, the auctioneer. He wants me to bring that woman and the two children over to the inn." He gestured toward his family. "He thinks he's got a buyer for them." The guard opened the envelope, read the message, nodded his head. Then, because John extended his hand, he handed the envelope and the note back to him. Opening the gate of the pen, he went inside. "Get along there now," he said, pushing the woman and her two children out, separating them from the others. John walked down the street beside them, still holding the envelope as though it were a talisman. They moved slowly. His wife was carrying the baby, and the small child walked beside her, holding on to her skirts. It seemed to him they crawled along the street, and he wanted to run, to urge them to run, and, of course, dared not. He ignored his wife's questions. There was despair in her voice as she said, "What does it mean? Why are you taking us to be sold? Oh, John, how could you?" "Hush," she said sternly, "don't talk. You've just got to trust me." It was noon, so there was no one in the street. The town seemed to sleep in the cold sunlight. He supposed folks were in their houses eating, even the children. He kept thinking that it ought to take the auctioneer about 2 hours to eat and drink and talk up the afternoon sale. He crossed the street with his family, still moving slowly, breathing hard, appalled at his own daring. But it was either this, doing what he had done, or lose his wife and children for good. Halfway down the street he paused, looked back. The street was empty. "Quick now," he said. He opened the gate of a picket fence in front of one of the big houses. "Hurry, hurry," he said, urging them to go faster around the side of the house to the back door. As they approached the door it opened for them. His Quaker friend said, "Thee made it, John, with the help of the Lord, as I knew thee would." They stayed in the attic of the house until dark. Then they went downstairs to the kitchen, where they were fed. After they finished eating, the Quaker led them out of the house. There was a farmer's wagon in the dooryard. They climbed in, lay on the floor of the wagon, blankets were thrown over them. It was not a long ride, but it was a jouncing one. When the wagon stopped and the driver got down and threw the blankets back, John knew he was near the river. He could smell it. All of them got into a rowboat at the edge of the river. The driver of the wagon rowed them out to a small fishing boat where John Bowley and his family embarked for Baltimore. There was food on the boat and blankets, and he knew where he was going, knew how to sail a boat, knew that he would be met by someone, and yet he was vaguely uneasy. The children went to sleep quickly. He and his wife talked, not a lot, just now and then. If it weren't for the feeling of uncertainty, pinprick of fear, he would have enjoyed sailing up the Chesapeake on this cold, starry night. He was sailing without lights, and so was more aware of the night than he had ever been. He could smell fish from the boat, could see lights from the other boats. He had been told that when he got near Baltimore he was to watch for 2 lights close together, a yellow one and a blue one. When he saw them he was to get in the dinghy and row to them. He kept worrying about it. Suppose he missed the lights. Suppose. Toward morning there was faint color in the sky. Not really daylight, a lifting of the darkness. He kept peering at the shore. Suddenly he saw the lights, a yellow one and a blue one, and sailed towards them. He got his wife and children in the dinghy and rowed shoreward. As he drew nearer he saw where the lights were from, 2 barn lanterns, the shades tinted, one blue and the other yellow. There was a wagon quite close to the shore in a wooded area, a bent-over figure on the seat. To his surprise he saw that it was a woman, a white woman, tremendously fat, who turned and watched him as he got out of the boat. "Who are you?" she asked. At first he could only whisper, for he did not know what to expect. Then he said, "A friend with friends." That was the password he had been told to use. "God bless you, you made it," she said. "I've been watching for 2 mornings straight." Then she started moving forward for so large a woman, moving quickly for so large a woman. The wagon held potatoes and onions, not as many of them, but quite a few. She rearranged the load. John and his wife lay down in the back of the wagon with the small child, and the fat woman took the baby and held it in her arms, then wrapped it loosely under the shawl she wore over her coat. John thought, "She's so big nobody'll know that baby was there." The woman said, "I got to cover you up," and threw blankets over them. Again it was a long, jouncy ride. When the wagon stopped they were in the yard of a stable, and it was broad daylight. They stayed inside the stable all that day. The fat woman said she would be back for them that night, and she gave them a package of food. They ate quickly, hungrily. Then they just sat waiting for night. When it was dark the woman came for them. They climbed in the wagon again. This time they only went a short distance. The fat woman helped them out of the wagon, guided them toward the back door of a brick house. She tapped lightly at the door. Someone opened it. They all went inside. John looked at the short, stocky figure standing in the middle of a big, warm kitchen. It was a man, a stranger, and yet he thought the face was familiar. Then his wife said, laughing, "Harriet! It's Harriet!" "A friend with friends," she said, and chuckled. They stayed in the house in Baltimore for a week. After that Harriet, fearless, self-assured, guided them from one station stop to the next. At each house word was sent on to the next stop to be on the alert to watch for this party of fugitives. Thus Harriet became aware of a new undercurrent of fear all along the route. When she reached Philadelphia with her passengers, she took them straight to the office of the Philadelphia Vigilance Committee. There the talk was about the new fugitive slave law, now 3 months old, and what it would mean to people like herself and to the people who offered them shelter. People convicted of harboring slaves could be imprisoned or fined so heavily that they would lose everything they owned. As for the runaways, they might be shot out of hand or whipped and sold to the Deep South, where they would die anyway. It was this that had created the undercurrent of fear. The Fugitive Slave Law was one of the concessions made to the South as part of the Compromise of 1850. Henry Clay, John C. Calhoun, and Daniel Webster believed that this compromise would heal the rapidly growing breach between the North and the South. Actually, it only served to widen it, primarily because of the terms of the new law covering fugitive slaves. In the North, men who had been indifferent to slavery, men who had been openly hostile towards the abolitionists, men who hated Garrison and his newspaper, The Liberator, with a deep and abiding hatred, were stirred to anger. They said that the new law turned them into slave catchers. They said they would not lift so much as a finger to help Southern slave owners catch their runaways. Even more important, they began to question the logic of the Southern apologists for slavery. They said that if enslaved Negroes enjoyed all the goods of life that their masters said they did, there would be no runaway slaves. Why then were they taking to their heels in such numbers that it was necessary to pass a law to compel them to enjoy the benefits they derived from slavery?